Thanks everybody for joining us again. Breathing Conversations here with Katie here at Dual Citizen Brewing Company. We are here to finish some of the questions that were left over from Friday the 5th.
We're going to keep this going. The submission form is still open, so if you have further questions that come up from tonight, we're going to try and keep this going for, hopefully a while, because we know that there's a lot of work to do and a lot to be talked about. How has Modist benefited from systems of white supremacy? How have they not? It's a brewery that was started and is owned by 4 white men. So their experience in the beer industry has been that of white men. They've always been granted the fundamental assertion that they have the right to be there and to own it and to start it. And to have that be invested in, and all of those things kind of create this larger, really strong infrastructure that, someone, a black person, a woman, a queer transgender person would not have.
And it pretty much boils down to privilege, right? In a lot of ways at the end of the day as well. It's not that we can't say, right, they've worked hard for it, but at the end of the day, it's the benefits that come along with that work, hard work, where other folks wouldn't necessarily get, not the extent to like the same recognition, but also the benefit of what else they might have put into that work, but also the continuous privilege that these folks still pertain.
In 1900, black farmers owned 15% of American farmland. Now it's 0.5%. Can you talk about your point of view on the impact of this history on the beer industry? What is your point of view on the part that breweries could play in the greater picture of dismantling white supremacy by championing clean water, not only for what they source for their beer, but also for water in their neighboring communities and around the world?
A few studies that came out a few years ago where North Minneapolis has some of the largest lead poisoning in the entire Minnesota as a state. So that is part of what it's talking about as far as like environmental racism. But in terms of like agriculture, if we go back to history, when Social Security was set up as a law, we can go back to when the GI Bill was set up as a law, where it left out specifically a lot of agricultural workers back in the 1900s, a lot of hospitality workers, which most of those folks, again, were black and brown folks. So there's, and when we're seeing what the effect of some of those laws that were set up, 100 years ago, how that affects people to this day, in terms of when you talk about generational wealth impact, but also the continuum of what current laws and corporations that get away with breaking the law, and still there isn't any repercussions for it.
This question for me is just so amazing and so important, because there is so much more to this and so many more layers than just, this is not just about the liquid. This is not just about the space that we're in. This is about all of the jobs in the adjacent industries, the surrounding industries, and how those are impacted as well by white supremacy. And so I think that's why it's so important that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
If there are no black farmers, if there are no black businesses that aren't directly connected with or partnered with, then Modist and all the other breweries are going to continue what they've always done in terms of only partnering with white audiences and only white businesses. So there's a lot of relational there as well, and that's the impact of what white supremacy is, not just in historical proportions, but also how it still affects folks.
Why can every race have pride in their heritage except for white people?
You might say Black Pride is Black History Month. You might say Native or Indigenous History Month is Indigenous Pride. But we know what white pride is at the end of the day, right? White pride is what got Columbus here and ended up slaughtering and committing genocide on Native nations, where we don't have any of those folks, where we don't have any of those languages, where we don't have any of those histories anymore. That's white pride. White pride is what happened in Utah not too long ago, where the city council or the educational council decided that they can teach American history, but black history should be an elective. So if parents wanted to drop their kids out of black history, that they could, that was an elective. That is white pride.
I have an immense amount of pride in my family heritage and my lineage and where I came from. When I was a child, I came home from school. We were learning about slavery. I don't know how old I was. I don't know what grade I was in. And we were learning about slavery in the most whitewashed, palatable way, where it was basically conferred as like, black people working on a farm. And even just that, like me as a child of whatever age, I go home and I looked at my mother square in the eyes and I told her that I was ashamed to be white. And I was like, Mom, I am ashamed of this. I can't believe I feel shame. She looked at me and told me, she's like, you need to do better. You're not doing that. We're not doing that. Our families have not been part of that. But you have to do better, and you have to treat everyone equally, and you have to learn how to do better and be better. I need to dismantle what happened to me in those years between having that reaction and talking to my mom when I first initially started learning about this, and being able to be an adult now and own my actions and be able to look at things in an analytical way and say, how can I contribute to the betterment of everyone? And moving forward and being able to help dismantle that, because I know I didn't create it. I can't personally dismantle it, but I can sure as fuck do some work with the time that I have and what I've been given.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the important ways, right? New York, there's still, we celebrate, everybody goes green, St. Patty's Day. So, that is an Irish pride right there. You go to New York, there's Italian parade. So, that to a certain extent, even if you feel like your family hasn't participated in, right? And the important stuff of understanding about white supremacy is knowing the comforts that it still gives you, even if your family wasn't around and participated in it. Knowing the comforts and the privileges that you still exude from it to this day, even in your journey of wanting to dismantle and being a part of an anti-racist society, it's knowing how you still can benefit from white supremacy on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. What is Modist doing to dismantle white supremacy at their brewery? Also, what about having more racial representation within the industry to make POC feel more welcomed and safe? I think we touched on it, and and I brought up that we're, doing, reading and whatever work with the leadership team, but just more tangible things that we're doing, because I know a lot of people are like, okay, cool, we can sit around and read all day, and as far as tangible and actionable things, I don't know exactly what needs done at this very second in our space, and so starting the work of just acknowledging that, and then having staff participate in that training and having it be an ongoing thing. This isn't going to be a set it and forget it. That's not, I can tell you right now that's not what that's going to be.
I can relate to what the question person is asking in terms of those of us that have been to a lot of beer festivals or go to a lot of tap rooms know what it's like when you're walking around and you see maybe one other person of color, BIPOC person, or one other black person. The question of white supremacy, these are spaces that were specifically designed, or even if they weren't designed by fault, then become the default of everything else, which is, again, white supremacy. The first rule to solving a problem is knowing that there is a problem. So these conversations are really important for that. Internally, right, every brewery that's here in Minnesota has to kind of grapple with that in terms of what diversity, inclusion means for them. But most importantly, I think the question for all the breweries would have to be, just like for everybody else who benefits from white supremacy, is one, how uncomfortable are you willing to get? And two, I think, what are you willing to give up more than anything? And those are things that not just individuals have to ask themselves, but the breweries also have to ask themselves as how uncomfortable are you willing to be in learning about this and holding yourself accountable? But more importantly, what are you willing to give up to prove that you are serious about taking white supremacy seriously, but also about diversity and inclusion? Anyone watching this who is a BIPOC person, I would like to extend you an invitation that Brewing Change Collaborative is open. We have a monthly open to BIPOC folks meetings. It's Zoom, so we gotta be safe. If you are watching this and would like a community of like-minded folks, it doesn't have to be about beer. We have plenty of people that like tequila. We have, plenty of people that don't drink as well. So this is about community and engaging each other and building power through being together. So if you would like to be a part of Brewing Change Collaborative, we are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And any white passing BIPOC are also welcome, obviously.
How can we, fellow beer consumers, be an extension of the work that Brewing Change Collaborative is doing and help contribute/educate in our own communities and breweries?
I think it starts with one, educating yourself, right? And I think holding yourself accountable and the people around you accountable. That's the start. And we're talking about also holding the industry accountable, but first and foremost, it starts with the individual. And then from there, obviously, we're, as far as Brewing Change, we do have open meetings that are open to non-BIPOC as well. So if you would like to learn more about the work and what we do, we obviously invite people to certainly come over, whether it's through Zoom call or in-person meetings.
What do you think stops other breweries from taking such stances? I think that's a really important and really interesting question. I think one of the biggest roots of lack of action is who am I to act? And I think that's something that I know myself, I kind of grappled with. Like, I'm on the board of directors for the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild, and this summer, after George Floyd's murder, we had, Modist ourselves had put out our own pretty decisive statement of where we were at and the stance that we were going to take, and the guild didn't. And the initial thought process was, who are we to speak up on this? And now looking back, it's everyone's place to speak up on this.
I do remember the guild, the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild, not knowing what to do because they got called out by it. Brewing Change called them out, and then they came out and realized, what impact that they had and how much power that they had.
I think everyone is so scared of, making a misstep or admitting that you don't know everything. That's a really tough thing to do. And then especially as a business, it's a very contrary thing. And I think a lot of times too, people are probably scared they're gonna lose fans. And to that, I would just say fucking let them go then. I don't know, that's easy for me to say from my position, and I'm not an owner at Modist, so that's really easy for me to say. But if someone is gonna not engage with your brand because you are standing on the side of human rights, are they someone that you want engaging with your brand to begin with?
Again, whether it is an entire group of breweries' board that don't know how much power they have, or whether it's the individual that doesn't feel like it, for one, it's their place to speak, or they don't know how much impact they could have, or like you said, maybe the small town brewery somewhere in small town Minnesota is concerned with losing customers, losing distributors, losing liquor stores, losing bars. But as an individual or as a business, if if you're much more concerned about not saying the right thing because you don't know how to say it, or you're much more concerned with losing customers or losing revenue at the end of the day, imagine what it feels like being a BIPOC in this country. Imagine what it feels like living through this on a daily basis.
Have you had any interactions or conversations with individuals or people who believe white supremacy does not exist? If so, did you have any success influencing a change of their opinion? Yes, there have been conversations about that. We've had a little bit of pushback, and I mentioned this even on the 5th, that we've had a little bit of pushback from a handful of consumers who seem pretty distraught that they're getting a little side of conversation or social justice, or I don't know, anything that's not just like hops in a can. And we're happy to have these conversations. And just because you think that this doesn't exist, that you don't think white supremacy exists, guess what? You don't get to make that call. And trying to tell another human being whether or not what they're experiencing is real is gaslighting. There are lots of interactions, there are lots of conversations. There are a lot of people who have kind of come out and just been like, why? Why? Because this doesn't exist. This is something that is fabricated. If that's where your thought process is, I think the best thing to do is sit down and ask yourself whether or not you've considered the fact that the way that you experience the world might not be the only way that the world is experienced. And I think that might be a really, really important starting point and somewhere to like really kind of dig into and grasp onto. If so, did you have success influencing a change of their opinion? I don't know. I don't know what the metric for that is. All I know is that I will continue until I am blue in the face to say that just because you don't experience something yourself and as an individual does not mean that it doesn't exist. Like, your lack of experience does not negate its existence.
But yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways like the post-racial movement in a way where it's like, I don't see color, so what is it? What are you talking about, to a certain extent? So we've already had Obama for 8 years. This country is far ahead. But in a lot of ways also, I think, the educational system that we've had in this country is part of it, right? Where Texas wanted to get rid of the word slave out of their educational curriculum because it seemed to hit a certain spot with white parents and white families and white kids. And I don't think anything that you say could change someone's mind. Like, they have to be able to come to grips with, for one, who they are and what privilege means and what white supremacy is. And if they don't believe that there is color, feel like they're post-racial, it's really hard to have a conversation if you can't start with something as simple as, hey, yeah, there is a huge inequality in this country. There is a lot of issues that we have.
I think another important piece of that too, this like kind of false equivalence or like conflation, it's like, oh, white privilege. It's like, well, I've worked hard for what I got. And it's like, nobody said that you haven't, like the idea and like where the privilege comes in is that you get to look around and feel comfortable wherever you are. You see yourself represented when you turn on the TV. You don't have to like worry about the way that you act if you get pulled over. You don't have to teach your children a different way of interacting with certain systems of power. The privilege is like at its most distilled, at least in my understanding and from what I've learned so far, is the fact that you are given the fundamental and granted right that your life is worth something. And I think a lot of that defensiveness comes in and is rooted in that, like, that kind of thinking,
Well, that's certainly interesting. And I think part of it really, just thinking about all of these questions, and just in general, like past conversations, I think a lot of it might actually also be rooted in the fundamental understanding of where BIPOC folks come from and how they grew up in this country and how they're brought in this country, and the realities that not only those of us that are millennials have grown up in this country have known, but also our parents, our grandparents, right? It goes back generationally, versus even the most innocent and progressive-minded and liberal-minded parent and how they raise their kids. I think folks that are taught the greatness of America, right, and the exceptionalism of what America is, have a completely different idea of those of us that have realized what that greatness meant, right? Like you said, where you can't get out of your house not knowing whether or not you're going to come back because of the realities, right? Where a 12-year-old black child in Cincinnati, Ohio, goes out to play with a BB gun in a park, and an officer comes by and, because he was told that someone was playing with the gun, and comes out and gets out of his car and within less than 2 seconds shoots a 12-year-old, and that officer is acquitted. So there are realities of what exceptionalism and what America means to the real America, those of us that have grown up and still are willing to get up in the morning and go to work hoping, that things continue for us, at least as far as being alive. So when it comes to then pointing out that there is a completely different reality of that, I can understand how someone, right, could say, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about.
Logistically, how can we reform our police department into something new for a more just society?
I'd say, look into what local orgs are doing. Black Visions Collective, Reclaim the Block, MPD 150, that are doing really, really great work around this topic particularly. But at the end of the day, whatever the conversation might be that comes out of Jacob Frey's office as far as reforming, that is what every mayor has said in the city, right? R.T. Ryback has talked about reforming the police department for a long time. Jacob Frey, while he was a city council member, talked about reforming the police department when Jamar Clark got murdered. Folks basically were over at the 4th Precinct, and he was a city council member at the time. He talked about reforming the police, and it's basically the same dance. And now they're taking credit, as far as I'm concerned, like with what the city council passed not too long ago, as far as they got rid of chokeholds, and that is the most reform that they could come up with, as far as really, really putting out a real change. At the end of the day, I think there was, and I can't remember if it was the Star Trip or the Pioneer. I don't have the facts for that. But they looked at calls from Minneapolis where it was like close to 70 to 80% of emergency calls for where folks dialed 911 were for non-emergency calls, where where the police didn't need to be there at the end of the day. So there are certainly ways, as far as the defund the police and the abolish the police movement, where we can take resources from the police department that is not needed, and give it to community resources, community organizations, mental health resources, civil service resources. There's so many other ways that we can connect people with the help they need, than what's happened to so many BIPOC folks at the end of the day. And one more thing, as far as reform is concerned, it's, the current chief that we have, Chief Arredondo, sued the police department of Minneapolis in 2007 and won, because Bob Kroll and some of the other officers that he named in his suit were white supremacists and racists, literally. Anti-discriminatory lawsuit, and the current chief won, and now we're asking the same police chief to reform, right? There was an article by the Star Tribune not too long ago that talked about how the 3rd Precinct that just burned down had officers that played by their own rules, was how the Star Tribune article, literally, they went and researched this. So the same precinct that had those officers that burned down, now those officers are in other precincts in the city, and Jacob Frey's still talking about reforming the police department.
What are some ways you feel white allies can stand in solidarity with our fellow BIPOC family and help dismantle white supremacy?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what we said earlier about one, learning what being anti-racist means for you, right? Knowing what privileges you have, and holding yourself first and foremost accountable, and then doing the same with your friends, with your family members, holding yourself accountable and others. I think it's the start, first and foremost. Yeah, from there, work with local organizations that are doing really great work here in the city.
How can white allies support Brewing Change Collaborative?
Yeah, if you haven't heard, that is one way of supporting, is buying merch from Brewing Change Collaborative. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, and we have 2 different groups on Facebook. We have members and non-members for allies as well, to know more about what we are doing. Yeah, most importantly, buy some of the merch that we have. That's one way of supporting Brewing Change Collaborative.
How do you feel about Black History Month? Should we celebrate it? Is it performative? How do we move past only talking about racism when it relates to heroes and holidays and go deeper, making this a conversation 365 days a year versus just during the shortest month of the year?
History, particularly like BIPOC history, and particularly Black history, is not all about the struggles and sufferings that right folks have went through in this country. Folks have done so much for this country in other ways that people should and could learn from at the end of the day. And if you're only learning Black History Month because it's hey, that's it, or if you're only learning about Juneteenth because of Juneteenth, then there's so much that you're missing of what folks have done in this country. And that goes again, same for other people of color.
How can we make breweries more welcoming and inclusive places for BIPOC?
So for folks that want to be diverse and inclusive, whatever that means, have to take into account then what their hiring processes is like, right? If all of a sudden now you want to become a brewery owner in small town Minnesota, and the only people that you're looking to invest with or become owners with are the same friends that you hung out with in high school or in college, then that is definitely going to reflect on who you hire down the line afterwards. So as far as the people that you hire and put in positions of power, whether it's on the marketing side, on the managing side, or even within those folks, the only people that they're going to bring in are going to be the same folks that also, right? It's basically a chain link. And that's what happens when we walk into a tap room and you don't see many people that look like you. Folks have to be willing to know what within their privilege they're willing to give up, right? Say, if you have an owner that does also an HR work, are you willing to give up that position and hire a BIPOC HR person? Are you willing to have a BIPOC accounting firm or someone who does accounts to bring in versus, the $500 that you would save a month from hiring your uncle who retired as an accountant, right? There are certain things I think that brewers really don't think about. And you're not thinking about it, for one, because you're thinking from your bottom line, for one, but two, you don't realize that you're also perpetuating what every other brewery has done. So it comes back to, again, what are you willing to give up and how uncomfortable are you willing to get with yourself to achieve what you're trying to do as far as having an inclusive workforce for your taproom.
How can we look to dismantle white supremacy if it is so intertwined in our capitalist economy? Is it even possible to truly address white supremacy without also addressing how capitalism fails so many groups of people in our society? How can we bring about a radical change to our society via our economy if so many Americans remain complacent on the issue of white supremacy? I wish I could be more eloquent about it, and I will try and find this article and be able to share it in some way because it was so interesting. But it was this idea that where they are is not a stasis. So like where they are as far as their class, like it's this idea of like bootstrap mentality. I'm going to vote for where I want to be, not where I am. You know, like I'm going to make sure and set myself up so that in the future when I just haven't had my $1 million idea yet. I just haven't won the lottery yet. And that's the root of where people vote, because their own inability to realistically look at where they are is not where they will end up. And that's what's sold. And that's not the check that comes out at the end of the day.
I don't know. I mean, the simple answer would be a revolution, right? And what is a revolution at the end of the day, right? What does that mean? Almost every person has a different explanation or description of what that means, but I think Angela Davis would probably say it's just grasping things at the roots. So again, having the open conversations about what that means. I mean, he's spot on in terms of how white supremacy, capitalism are innately related. And again, it's a system that was specifically designed that way by what folks call the founding fathers, right? Rich white dudes to a certain extent that owned land, that wanted free labor and didn't want women and BIPOC folks not to vote or have any freedom. That is how the system was specifically designed. And then with the Southern strategy, LBJ saying, what was it? If you can convince the poorest of white folks that they're better off than the wealthiest black man, they will continue to vote for you at the end of the day. So there's a certain element to like he's alluding to as far as poor white folks that are still willing to uphold capitalistic ideas. And part of it, again, is what we said earlier about how great America is. So no matter how dire or horrible my situation is, America is so great that I can still make it, right? I still might have that $1 million idea, whatever that means, that it's not as bad as other people are making it out to be.
How do you make your goals in dismantling white supremacy, systemic racism less daunting to you personally? And how do you balance this with the importance of making an actual impact with one's words and actions? To me, what makes it less daunting is knowing and understanding that this will be continuous. This isn't like I need to put in all this work for 7.5 years and then all of a sudden I'm gonna get to some spot. So just the fact that I'm even starting makes it less daunting. For me personally, it's doing stuff like this. This is terrifying to me. I am so scared of saying the wrong thing. I am petrified of it. That's what kept me in my holding pattern for so long, was this idea that I don't know enough. I'm not educated enough to be able to step into this realm. So I'm just going to be silent. And I just I know I can't do anything to change that. And so now the idea that I'm even doing something like this is so wildly outside of something. And I think it's just, it's that challenging. It's that willing to be uncomfortable. It's that willing to make yourself vulnerable and put yourself in that position and say, it's okay to keep learning.
I mean, and within that too, it's really important to know that, right? A lot of people are also afraid, I think, of how they might be perceived if they make that mistake, where it's right? And a lot of that, part of that is also the white fragility and the white defensiveness to a certain extent, where I would like to, but if I do make a mistake, will I be held accountable to a certain extent? Or, how will I be perceived after I make that mistake? It doesn't matter, right? If you're willing to be wrong about something, and when someone corrects you, you can take it and not be defensive about it, right? Then that's all that matters. We're all fucking human beings at the end of the day. And we live and breathe also white supremacy as BIPOC people in this country. So it's being willing to, when someone points out something, just willing to take it, listen, and then learning, and then moving on from there. There's just no way to make it less daunting, because again, we deal with it on a daily basis. It's affected our grandparents, it's affected our parents, it's affecting us, it's affecting our children. There's just no way to make it less daunting. I think it's more of a call to action as far as, again, knowing what you need to do, and really being comfortable enough, and being uncomfortable enough to be able to face it, and deal with it. It is a daunting task for all of us. But again, it's a system created by white people, and only white people can dismantle this. It's not a work for us at the end of the day. We're dealing with the effects of it on a daily basis.
I have the privilege of choosing to engage in the work. That is like something that has just been so powerful, and so something that I have been trying to grapple with, like, is the fact that like I get to choose when I'm going to engage with it, and like I get to set aside a time or decide I'm not in the mood. And for me, that's something that like is part of like what I'm trying to move myself out of, as far as like that comfort level, and like making, you know, is if I don't feel like I'm in the mood to engage with it, like just sit with that for a second and go like, I have that choice right now. And the fact that I have that choice right now is not something that other people have. Thank you so much for joining us for the follow-up to the first breathing conversations. And please keep the questions coming. We've already got a couple that we're going to be rolling into what will end up being part 3. So we hope that you'll join us for that. You can continue to submit questions in the meantime on modistbrewing.com/breathing conversations. And we hope to see you again very soon.
Yeah, thank you for having us again. If you have any questions for Brewing Change, please send it to any of the socials, Instagram, Facebook. Otherwise, you can also email at brewingchangecollab@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you again for the 3rd installment.